The dining room of Whitfield Hall glowed with the light of 40 candles. Silver gleamed on white linen. 12 guests sat around the long table, and every one of them was important. But the most important of all sat near the head of the table, tall and quiet, with dark eyes that seemed to notice everything. Nathaniel, the Duke of Ashworth. He had barely spoken all evening. He had listened, nodded, answered politely when spoken to. And then, halfway through the second course, he turned his head, not toward the hostess, Mrs. Whitfield, who had been talking without rest for 20 minutes, not toward her daughter Vivian, who sat beside him in pale blue silk, laughing at everything he said. No, he turned toward the far end of the table, toward the young woman in the plain gray dress, the one who had not said a single word all night. "And what do you think, Miss Whitfield?" The room went still. A fork stopped halfway to a mouth. A footman froze at the door. Somewhere down the table, a glass was set down very, very carefully. Because everyone in that room knew the rule, everyone except the Duke. Clara Whitfield did not speak at the dinner table, not ever. Mrs. Whitfield recovered first. She smiled that smooth, sweet smile she wore the way other women wore jewelry, and said lightly, "Oh, Your Grace, you must forgive her. Clara does not speak at the table. Manners, you understand." The Duke did not smile back. He looked at Mrs. Whitfield for a long moment, and then he said one single word. "Whose?" One word, that was all. And in that one word something in the room shifted, like the first small crack in a frozen lake. But to understand why that single word changed everything, why it would bring down a house of lies 7 years in the making, you must first know how the silence began. You must go back to the night Clara Whitfield spoke at the table for the very last time. 7 years earlier, Clara was 13 years old, and her heart was still broken. Her mother had died in the spring. Clara remembered her as warmth and lavender water, as a soft voice reading to her by the fire, as gentle hands braiding her hair. Margaret Whitfield had been the kind of woman servants loved and neighbors trusted. When she died, the whole house seemed to grow colder, as if she had taken the fires with her. Clara's father, Mr. Edward Whitfield, was a good man but a weak one, and grief made him weaker. He was a merchant with business in London and Bristol, away for weeks at a time, and he could not bear the empty house. Everyone said he married again too quickly. He married a widow named Harriet, a handsome woman with a daughter of her own, a girl named Vivian, 1 year older than Clara and pretty as a china doll. "She will be a mother to you," Clara's father said, holding Clara's small hands in his. "You'll see, my dear, the house will be warm again." Clara wanted to believe him. She truly did. For the first few months, Harriet was careful. She was sweet when Clara's father was home. She called Clara "my dear child" in front of guests. But children see things that adults miss, and Clara saw how her stepmother's eyes moved through the house like a woman counting coins. She saw how Harriet ran her fingers along the silver, studied the paintings, opened drawers when she thought no one was watching. And then came the dinner party, the one Clara would remember for the rest of her life. It was November. Her father was home for once, and Harriet had filled the house with guests, new friends, fine people, the kind of company she wished to keep. Clara wore her best dress and sat quietly as children should. She was happy that night. Her father was laughing again. The house was bright. Then Clara looked across the table, and her heart stopped. Around her stepmother's neck, glittering in the candlelight, was a necklace of pearls and small sapphires. Her mother's necklace. Clara knew it the way you know your own hand. Her mother had worn it every Christmas. Clara had played with it as a small child, sitting on her mother's lap, counting the little blue stones. Her mother had once kissed her forehead and whispered, "One day, my darling, this will be yours." Clara did not think. She was 13, and the words simply came out, clear and innocent in front of everyone. That was my mother's. Silence, just like the silence that would fall 7 years later, except this time it fell on a little girl. The guests looked up. Harriet's fork paused over her plate. Clara's father blinked, confused, as if waking from a dream. And for one short moment, Harriet's face showed something cold and frightened, there and gone, quick as a shadow. Then she laughed, a light silvery laugh. "Oh, the sweet child," she said to the guests. "She misses her dear mamma, of course. Edward, darling, I told you, I found this old piece in the jewelry box and thought it deserved to be worn again in Margaret's memory. Children do get confused." The guests smiled and murmured and moved on. Clara's father patted her hand and whispered, "There now, my dear, it's all right." And dinner continued as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. The next morning, Clara was called to her stepmother's sitting room. Harriet stood by the window, and her voice, when she spoke, was quiet and pleasant, which somehow made it worse. "Last night you embarrassed me in front of my guests," she said. "You embarrassed your father. A young lady who cannot control her tongue must learn. From today you will not speak at the dinner table. Not one word. When you can behave, we shall see." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but I only said, "That," said Harriet softly, "is exactly the problem, what you say." Clara waited for her father to fix it. He always fixed things in his gentle, tired way. But when she went to him, Harriet had gotten there first. He sighed and rubbed his forehead and said, "Just for a little while, Clara. Your stepmother knows about raising young ladies. It's only manners, my dear. It won't be forever." It won't be forever. Clara held on to those words, but her father left for Bristol the following week, and the little while did not end. At every meal, Clara sat in silence while Vivian chattered and Harriet ruled the table. If Clara so much as opened her mouth, one cold glance stopped her. The servants noticed and said nothing. What could they say? Months passed, then a year, then two. Whenever her father came home, the rule was softened just enough that he never saw its teeth. And whenever Clara tried to tell him, the words tangled in her throat because how do you explain a thing that sounds so small? She isn't allowed to speak at dinner. It sounded like nothing. It felt like drowning. And here is the strange thing, the thing Clara would only understand many years later. It was never really about manners. It was never about that one innocent sentence. It was about what that sentence had almost uncovered. But Clara was a child, and she could not see it yet. The years turned. Clara grew tall and quiet, with her mother's gray eyes and a habit of watching everything. And then, in the autumn of her 20th year, 7 years after the silence began, the letter came that broke what was left of her world. Her father was coming home from Bristol. For good this time, he wrote. He had matters to settle, important matters. Things I should have seen to long ago, my dear Clara, things I must put right. Clara read that letter until she knew it by heart. Things I must put right. For the first time in years, hope lit inside her like a small candle. He came home on a Tuesday, gray-faced and older, but he kissed her forehead the way he used to, and he spent that whole evening shut inside his study with his papers. Through the door, Clara heard the scratch of his pen, on and on, late into the night. She went to bed happy. God forgive her, she went to bed happy. The screaming woke her before dawn. It was one of the maids, crying out in the corridor below. Clara flew from her bed down the stairs, her bare feet cold on the wooden floor, and stopped. The study door stood open. Her father lay slumped over his desk, perfectly still, his pen fallen from his hand. The doctor would later call it his heart. A tragedy, everyone would say. Such a shock, poor man. But Clara had reached the top of the stairs a moment before the other servants came running. And from there, in the gray half-light, she had seen something no one else saw. She had seen her stepmother slipping out of the study, calm, unhurried, fully dressed at 5 o'clock in the morning, with a bundle of papers in her hands. They buried Edward Whitfield on a cold, wet morning, and Clara stood at the graveside with her heart in pieces. She tried to tell someone what she had seen. She truly tried. The day after her father died, she gathered all her courage and spoke to the doctor, her voice shaking. The night he passed, I saw my stepmother coming out of his study, very early. She was carrying papers. The doctor gave her a kind, tired look, the look adults give to grieving children. "My dear Miss Whitfield," he said gently, "your stepmother sat up all night with the household accounts. She told me so herself. Grief plays tricks on us. Do not let it turn to poison." And that was that. Harriet had gotten there first. Harriet always got there first. When the will was read, the lawyer, a thin, careful man named Mr. Crane, who never quite looked anyone in the eye, announced that Edward Whitfield had left everything to his beloved wife Harriet. The house, the money, all of it in her hands until the daughters married, and their marriages in her hands too. To Clara there was nothing personal at all. No letter, no keepsake, not one word. Clara sat very still as the will was read, and one thought circled in her mind like a moth around a flame. "Things I must put right, my dear Clara." He had written that. He had come home to do something. He had spent his last night alive writing. And whatever he had written, it was not this. But she was 20 years old with no money, no family, and no proof of anything. Who would listen? The doctor had smiled at her. The lawyer worked for Harriet. So Clara did the only thing she could do. She survived. If you had visited Whitfield Hall in the years that followed, you might not have noticed Clara at all. That was how Harriet designed it. Clara was not called a servant. Of course not. That would have caused talk. She was the quiet stepdaughter, poor thing, so withdrawn since her father died. But it was Clara who mended the linens, Clara who did the accounts Harriet found tiresome, Clara who cut the roses, wrote the menus, and made the house run. Her dresses were made over from old ones. Her room, little by little, had been moved to the smallest one at the end of the corridor, the one that caught the cold in winter. And still at every dinner the rule stood. 7 years now. Clara sat at the table like a shadow, and the silence that had once felt like drowning had become something else. It had become a place she lived. But here is what Harriet never understood. A woman who cannot speak learns to listen. A woman no one looks at learns to see. Clara heard everything in that house. She heard the servants' worries and helped where she could, a coin here, a kind word there, a quiet lie to cover for a maid who broke a cup. The servants loved her for it, silently, loyally. She heard Harriet's conversations too, the ones held in low voices behind doors. She heard the word debts more than once. She heard the name of Mr. Crane, the lawyer, who visited far too often for a household with nothing to settle. And one October afternoon, she heard a name that changed everything. Ashworth. "The Duke of Ashworth has come home at last," Harriet announced at dinner, her eyes bright in the candlelight. "The old Duke's son. He has been abroad for years, and now he has the title, the fortune, and no wife." She looked at Vivian the way a jeweler looks at a diamond. "Every mother in the county will be scheming, my love, but they are not you." Vivian smiled and touched her golden hair. At 21 she was lovely, and she knew it with a certainty that had never once been questioned. "They say he is handsome," she said, "and strange. He hardly speaks at all, they say." "A quiet husband," said Harriet, "is the very best kind." Clara kept her eyes on her plate. None of it concerned her. Nothing ever did. Except that this time she was wrong. Because 3 weeks later, Harriet swept into the morning room with a letter in her hand and triumph on her face. The Duke of Ashworth had accepted. He was coming to dinner at Whitfield Hall. The house was turned upside down. The best silver came out. The menu was written and rewritten. Vivian tried on 11 dresses. And the evening before the dinner, Harriet called Clara to her sitting room, to the same window where the silence had begun 7 years before. "You will sit at the table tomorrow," Harriet said. "If I hide you away, people talk, and I will not have talk. You will wear the gray. You will smile if smiled at." She stepped closer, and her voice dropped into that soft, pleasant tone Clara had learned to fear more than shouting. "And you will not speak. Not one word, Clara. This dinner will decide your sister's whole future. If you spoil it, I promise you, what you have lived these 7 years will feel like kindness." Clara looked at the floor and said, "Yes, ma'am." What else was there to say? She had long ago stopped expecting rescue. Dinners came and dinners went, and she was invisible at all of them. Tomorrow would be no different. That is what she told herself. And so we return at last to where our story began. 40 candles, 12 guests, Vivian in pale blue silk, laughing at everything the Duke said, though the Duke, Clara noticed, was not saying very much at all. She noticed other things too, in her quiet way, from her seat at the far end of the table. She noticed that he ate little and listened carefully. She noticed that his eyes moved around the table the way hers did, not the bored glance of a rich man, but the careful attention of someone who had learned to watch rooms rather than trust them. Once, when Harriet told an especially charming story about her dear late husband, Clara saw something flicker across the Duke's face. Not belief, something cooler. And twice, she caught him looking down the table, at her. Clara dropped her gaze to her plate, heart beating hard. "Do not be a fool," she told herself. "Men like him do not see girls like you. No one sees you. That is the whole design." Then came the second course. Talk turned to the new schools being built in the county, and whether teaching the poor to read did more harm than good. Harriet declared that too much reading gave the lower classes ideas above their station. Several guests nodded wisely. And that was the moment the Duke of Ashworth turned his head, looked straight down the length of that long white table, and said, "And what do you think, Miss Whitfield?" The fork stopped, the footman froze, the glass was set down without a sound. "Oh, Your Grace, you must forgive her. Clara does not speak at the table. Manners, you understand." "Whose?" The word dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Harriet's smile held, but Clara, who had studied that face for 7 long years, saw the effort behind it, the tiny tightening at the corners of her mouth. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace." "Whose manners?" the Duke said calmly. "I ask because in every house I have ever dined in, it is considered good manners to answer a direct question and rather poor manners to answer one addressed to somebody else." He let that sit for a breath, then turned back to Clara, and his voice, when he spoke to her, was different, quieter. "Miss Whitfield, the schools, what do you think?" Every eye in the room turned to Clara. 7 years. 7 years of swallowed words, of staring at plates, of being furniture in her own father's house. Her heart hammered so loudly she was sure the whole table could hear it. Across the candles, Harriet's eyes fixed on her, cold, commanding, promising consequences. And perhaps it was the Duke's steady gaze. Perhaps it was her father's voice, far away. "Things I must put right." Perhaps 7 years simply reaches an end, the way a rope frays and finally parts. Clara lifted her chin, looked at the Duke of Ashworth, and spoke at the dinner table for the first time in 7 years. "I think, Your Grace, that we rarely fear people learning to read." Her voice was low, but it did not shake. "We fear what they might finally be able to say." For a moment no one breathed. Then the Duke of Ashworth smiled, his first true smile of the entire evening, and raised his glass an inch toward her. "Precisely my view, Miss Whitfield." Somewhere down the table an old colonel chuckled and said, "Well said, by George." The conversation stumbled back to life. Vivian's laugh rang out a little too loudly, and Harriet Whitfield sat at the head of her table, smiling her jewelry smile, while her face turned slowly to stone. Clara looked back down at her plate, blood roaring in her ears, and understood two things with perfect clarity. The first was that something had just begun that could not be stopped. The second was that her stepmother would make her pay for it. To understand why the Duke of Ashworth asked that question, why, out of 12 guests at that glittering table, he turned to the one person everyone else had agreed not to see, you must know something about him that the county did not know. Nathaniel, Duke of Ashworth, master of Ashworth Park and one of the richest men in England, had spent his childhood being hidden. He had been born with a stutter, not a small one. When he was a boy, words would catch in his throat like birds in a net, beating and struggling, and the harder he fought, the worse it became. His father, the old Duke, had been ashamed of it, but it was his mother Clara would one day come to understand best, though she never met her. His mother, a proud and brilliant woman, had managed the problem the way she managed everything. She had silenced him. Whenever guests came to Ashworth Park, young Nathaniel was given his instructions. You will bow. You will smile. You will not speak. It was presented as kindness. We would not want the boy embarrassed, would we? And perhaps his mother even believed that. But Nathaniel, sitting mute at the end of his own family's table while conversation flowed around him like water around a stone, learned exactly what it felt like. It felt like being erased. The stutter faded as he grew, worn away by years of patient work with a tutor who was the first person ever to simply wait for him to finish a sentence. By the time he went abroad at 20, it surfaced only when he was very tired or very angry. He had spent a decade away, Vienna, Rome, Lisbon, managing his family's affairs and staying far from the mother who, even then, wrote letters advising him to speak as little as possible in company. She had died 2 years ago. His father followed last winter, and so Nathaniel had come home to a great empty house, a great heavy title, and the discovery that everyone in the county wanted something from him. He could not walk into a room without mothers rearranging their daughters like chess pieces. Everyone performed for him. Everyone chattered and flattered and laughed at things that were not amusing. That was why he noticed silence. He always noticed silence. He knew its taste too well. And at the Whitfield dinner, from the moment he sat down, he had tasted it at the far end of the table. He had accepted the invitation out of duty, expecting an evening exactly like all the others, and it had begun that way. The hostess talked without pause, steering every subject toward her daughter. Vivian plays, Vivian sings, Vivian was admired in Bath. The daughter laughed at everything he said, including the things that were not jokes. But down at the end of the table sat a young woman in gray, and something about her was wrong. Not her face. Her face was fine, quiet gray eyes, dark hair without ornament. What was wrong was the arrangement. She was seated where you seat a poor relation, below the doctor's wife. Her dress had been good once, several seasons ago. The footman served her last, and Nathaniel would have wagered a great deal that this was habit, not accident. And she did not speak. Course after course she did not speak. No one addressed her. No one glanced at her. 11 people had silently agreed she was not there. Nathaniel knew that agreement. He had lived inside it for years. So he began to watch carefully, the way he had learned to watch rooms as a silent boy. And the young woman in gray became, minute by minute, the most interesting person at the table. When the colonel mangled a line of poetry, a shadow of amusement crossed her face, quickly hidden. When the hostess told a touching story about her late husband, the girl's hand went still on the stem of her glass, and something passed over her features that was not grief. It was older and colder than grief. When a nervous young footman fumbled a serving spoon, she caught it neatly, set it right, and gave the boy a small nod that plainly said, "No harm done," all without a sound, all in half a second, while the rest of the table noticed nothing. She sees everything, Nathaniel thought. She simply is not permitted to say so. And then Mrs. Whitfield, warming to her theme about the schools, declared that reading gave the lower orders ideas above their station, and the wise heads nodded, and Nathaniel felt the old anger stir in him, the anger of every silenced person watching loud fools agree with each other. He turned and asked the question before he had decided to ask it. "And what do you think, Miss Whitfield?" He saw the room freeze and understood at once that he had broken a rule everyone else knew. Then came the hostess's smile and the words that told him everything. "Clara does not speak at the table. Manners, you understand." Manners, his mother's word exactly, spoken in the same sweet, reasonable, poisonous tone. "Whose?" he said. And when the girl finally spoke, when she lifted her chin and said that thing about fearing what people might finally be able to say, Nathaniel felt something he had not felt in any drawing room in 10 years. He felt recognized. He stayed precisely as long as courtesy required, then made his farewells. Mrs. Whitfield pressed him to come again. Vivian said something delightful. He heard neither. In the carriage rolling home through the dark, he found he could not stop turning the evening over in his mind. Clara does not speak at the table. Since when? By whose order? And why did the mother's eyes, all through that little speech, carry the particular brightness of a woman telling a rehearsed lie? His valet would say later that his Grace was uncommonly quiet that night, even for his Grace. Nathaniel was a careful man. He did not trust easily. His mother had taught him that people perform, and the lesson had gone deep. So in the days that followed, he did what careful men do. He asked questions lightly, in passing, the way a man asks about a neighborhood he is new to. His steward, his housekeeper who had a sister in service near Whitfield Hall, an old tenant farmer who remembered everyone. The picture that came back was strange. Everyone spoke well of the late Mr. Whitfield, a decent man, often away. Everyone spoke carefully of the widow. Very capable, they said, in the flat voice people use when they mean something else. And the elder daughter, the merchant's real daughter. Here the answers grew vague and uncomfortable. Keeps to herself. Quiet, poor thing. But the housekeeper's sister said one thing that stayed with Nathaniel for days. "Folk in that house say the young mistress hasn't been let to speak a word at that table in 7 years, Your Grace. Since she was a girl of 13. They call it discipline." The woman had hesitated, then added, "Begging your pardon, Your Grace, but the servants there don't call it that." 7 years, she had been 13, a child freshly motherless. That night Nathaniel sat late by the fire in the great silent library of Ashworth Park, and for the first time in years he deliberately let himself remember. The long table of his childhood, the guests, his mother's warning glance, the words beating in his throat like trapped birds. He remembered wanting just once for someone, anyone, to turn to him and ask him a question and wait. No one ever had. Well, he thought, perhaps that is a thing a man can mend. The chance came 10 days later, in the town's small subscription library, the one respectable place a young woman might go alone. Nathaniel had gone in for the London papers. He turned down the narrow aisle between the shelves, and there she was, Miss Clara Whitfield in her gray coat, standing on her toes, reaching for a volume on a shelf built for someone taller. She froze when she saw him. Her eyes went in one quick flash toward the door, and he understood that too. She was checking who might see, checking what it would cost her. "Miss Whitfield." He kept his voice low and reached up and brought the book down for her. He glanced at the spine and raised an eyebrow. "A history of the Roman Republic. Ideas above your station, I see." For a heartbeat she stared at him. And then, quick, involuntary, there and gone, Clara Whitfield smiled, and he saw what 7 years of dinners had never once been permitted to show. "I am told, Your Grace," she said quietly, "that reading is dangerous for exactly that reason." "I sincerely hope so." He handed her the book, And then, because the words had been waiting in him for 10 days or perhaps for 20 years, he said the rest. "You may speak freely with me, Miss Whitfield, here or anywhere. I find that silence is very rarely the silent one's choice." Clara looked up at him. This tall, grave stranger who had somehow, twice now, said aloud the exact truth of her life. And for one terrible, wonderful moment, she was afraid she might cry in the middle of the lending library. Instead, she took a slow breath, held his gaze, and asked the first free question of her adult life. "Then may I ask you something, Your Grace? Why does a man who owns the finest library in the county come to a little town lending room for his books?" Nathaniel considered her for a moment. There it was again, she saw everything. "Because, Miss Whitfield," he said, "a great house can be a very silent place. I imagine you know something of that." Neither of them heard the soft step at the end of the aisle. Neither of them saw the woman in the feathered bonnet, Mrs. Pemberton, the greatest gossip in 3 parishes, go very still behind the poetry shelf, her eyes wide, drinking in every word. By Sunday, it would be all over the county. And by Monday, it would reach Harriet Whitfield. Mrs. Pemberton did not disappoint. By Sunday, the story had traveled through 3 parishes, growing as it went. The Duke of Ashworth had been seen in the lending library, deep in private conversation with Miss Clara Whitfield, not Miss Vivian, the other one, the quiet one. He had fetched a book down for her. He had smiled, the Duke, who never smiled. Some versions had him holding her hand. One inspired version by Tuesday had them reading poetry aloud to each other. The county was delighted. There is nothing society loves more than a surprise. Harriet Whitfield heard it on Monday morning over tea, from a neighbor who delivered the news with wide, innocent eyes, and watched her face very carefully while she did it. Harriet's face gave that neighbor nothing at all. She laughed lightly, said something about kind gentlemen and lonely girls, and changed the subject with perfect grace. Then she went home, and the house learned what her silence sounded like. But here is what Harriet did not yet know. The library had not been the last meeting. It had been the first. They met again, always by accident, if you asked either of them, though the accidents grew remarkably regular. At church, the Duke's pew stood across from the Whitfield pew, and somehow, after the service, he was always near the door when Clara passed, and there was always a word or two. About the sermon, about the weather, about the book she was reading, which he had somehow always read as well. Then it was the lane by the mill stream, where Clara walked on the mornings when Harriet took the carriage to town. The first time, the Duke happened to be riding that way. The second time, no one pretended it was chance. He dismounted and they walked, his horse trailing behind them like a patient chaperone. And they talked. If you had asked Clara what they talked about, she could hardly have told you because it was everything. Books, Rome, his years abroad, the right way to grow roses, whether the old colonel's poetry was worse than the vicar's singing. Nothing that mattered, and so, somehow, everything that mattered. For 7 years, Clara had spoken only when necessary answers, instructions, yes ma'am, no ma'am. Now, walking down a muddy lane beside this grave, quiet man, she discovered that words were still in her. Thousands of them. Opinions and jokes and questions, all alive, all waiting, like seeds that had lain dormant under 7 winters and needed only 1 season of light. And Nathaniel, who had spent 10 years being performed at, listened. He asked what she thought, and then he waited for the answer. He did not fill her pauses. He did not finish her sentences. And when she said something sharp or funny, he would glance at her sideways with that almost smile, as if the two of them shared a secret the rest of the world was too loud to hear. One morning she told him about her mother, the lavender water, the reading by the fire, the braided hair. She had not spoken of her mother to a living soul in 7 years. Her voice cracked on it, and she stopped, ashamed. The Duke was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I used to have a stutter. As a boy, did you know that?" "No, Your Grace." "No one does. My mother took great care that no one would." And there on the lane by the mill stream he told her what he had never told anyone, the trapped words, the instructions before dinner, the long silent meals at his own family's table. "She called it protecting me," he said. "She may even have believed it. That is the trouble with people like that, Miss Whitfield. They wrap the cage in ribbon and call it a gift." Clara stopped walking. She looked up at him, this man who owned half the county, and saw a 13-year-old at the end of a long table, swallowing his words. "And I used to think," she said softly, "that I was the only one at a table like that." "So did I," said the Duke. "It appears we were both misinformed." That was the moment. Neither said so. Nothing improper passed between them, not so much as a touch of hands. But something changed on that muddy lane, quietly and completely, the way a season changes, and both of them walked home knowing it. Someone else knew it too. Vivian had been watching from the ridge above the stream, where she had followed on foot after one gossip too many. She stood very still, watching her plain, silent, invisible stepsister make the Duke of Ashworth laugh, actually laugh, head back, the sound carrying up the hill, and something ugly twisted inside her. She went straight home to her mother. Clara was summoned to the sitting room that evening. 7 years of instinct told her what was coming the moment she crossed the threshold. Harriet stood by the window in the last gray light, perfectly composed, and that was the worst sign of all. The sweetness was gone. She did not offer it, and she did not pretend. "Sit down, Clara." Clara sat. "You have been meeting him." It was not a question. The library, the lane, church under my very eyes, all the county chattering about it over their tea. Harriet turned from the window. "Did you imagine I would not hear?" "We have spoken," Clara said quietly. "Nothing more." "Nothing more," Harriet repeated the words as if tasting them. "Let me tell you what nothing more is, girl. Nothing more is Vivian's future. Nothing more is this family's one chance at real standing. And you," her voice never rose, it only dropped lower and cooler, which was infinitely worse. "You were told exactly what this dinner and this match meant. Yet the Duke has not called on Vivian once. Not once. Because his head has been filled with a gray little mouse who could not keep to her corner." Clara's hands were folded tight in her lap. Old training pulled her eyes toward the floor. She forced them up instead. "He asked me a question," she said. "I answered it. That is all I did. That was ever all I did." She meant this evening. She meant 7 years ago. And she saw by the flicker in Harriet's eyes that Harriet understood exactly. For a long moment, the room was silent. And then Harriet did something she had never once done in 7 years. She lowered the mask all the way. "Let me be plain with you, since kindness is wasted." She crossed the room and stood over Clara, close enough that Clara could see the fine powder on her cheeks. "You live in this house on my charity. You eat my bread. You have no money, no relations, no friends who signify. Everything you are stands on my goodwill, and my goodwill has conditions. If you speak to the Duke of Ashworth again, if you so much as smile at him across a church aisle, I will write to my cousins in Yorkshire." Clara went very still. "Your cousins?" "The Framptons. They keep a house for young women of a certain kind. Nervous young women, confused young women, women who see things, Clara, who imagine wicked stepmothers creeping about with papers in the night." Harriet's voice was almost gentle now, and her eyes were like glass in winter. "You spoke of it once to the doctor, do you remember? It is written down. Grief-stricken girl, sadly disturbed, makes wild accusations. One letter from me, one signature from a sympathetic physician, and you would find that a dinner table where no one lets you speak is the smallest silence there is." The clock ticked on the mantel. Somewhere below, a door closed, ordinary life continuing in a house where this was happening. "Do we understand one another?" Clara heard her own voice from very far away. "Yes, ma'am." "Good." The mask came back up, smooth and sweet, all in an instant, and that was the most frightening thing Clara had ever seen. "Then good night, my dear, sleep well." Clara did not sleep. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the cold little room at the end of the corridor, shaking, not weeping, just shaking, the way a person shakes when fear and fury share one body. Because she had heard two things in that room, and the second was almost lost inside the first. The first was the threat, and the threat was real. She knew such houses existed. Everyone knew. Doors that locked from the outside and respectable families who spoke of a daughter abroad. But the second thing, women who imagine wicked stepmothers creeping about with papers in the night. Clara had told the doctor about the papers 7 years ago. She had never once spoken of them since. She had half convinced herself down the long years that the doctor was right, that grief had painted the picture. Yet Harriet remembered. Word for word, after 7 years, Harriet remembered and kept it written down, loaded, ready. Innocent women do not keep such things ready. The shaking slowly stilled. Clara rose, knelt beside the bed, and pulled out the small wooden box that held everything left of her old life. There was little enough. A ribbon, a pressed flower from her mother's garden, and her mother's prayer book, small and worn, its cover soft from years of loving hands. She had held it for comfort 100 times. This time, alone in the candlelight with her heart pounding, she did what she had never thought to do. She went through it page by page. And near the back, where the binding had come loose from the spine, she found that the gap was not empty. Something had been pushed down inside it, folded small and flat. Paper. She worked it free with trembling fingers. It was half a letter, the top half, torn raggedly across. The paper was her father's. The hand was her father's, hurried and pressing hard, the hand of a man writing against time. "My dearest Clara, if you are reading this, then I did not find the courage or the hours to say it to your face, and for that I beg your forgiveness as I must beg it for so much else. I was blind for years because it was easier than seeing, but I have seen now. I have been to Crane and I know what she—" And there the tear cut across, and the rest was gone. Clara sat on the cold floor, the half-letter in her hands, reading those last unfinished words over and over while her candle burned down. "I have been to Crane, and I know what she—" What she what? Below her, somewhere in the sleeping house, a floorboard creaked and settled. Clara folded the letter with shaking hands, slid it back into the prayer book, and blew out the light. Her father had known something. He had died the very night he tried to write it down. And the other half of that letter was somewhere in this house. The invitation arrived on a silver tray 1 week later, and it changed everything in Whitfield Hall. The Duke of Ashworth was giving a ball, the first ball at Ashworth Park in a decade. Every family of consequence in the county was invited, and there, in firm black ink, the card requested the pleasure of the company of Mrs. Whitfield, Miss Whitfield, and Miss Vivian Whitfield. Miss Whitfield, Clara, by name and named first as the elder daughter should be, a courtesy the world had forgotten for 7 years. Harriet read the card 3 times, and Clara, standing silently by the door, watched her decide. She could not leave Clara home. The invitation was explicit, and one did not edit a duke. But Harriet had never yet met a problem she could not turn into a weapon, and Clara saw the exact moment, a small, cold settling around her stepmother's mouth, when the problem became a plan. "We shall all attend," Harriet said pleasantly. "How kind of His Grace." That evening she was almost warm to Clara. She spoke of ordering her a new dress. Nothing came of it, of course, but she spoke of it. She smiled across the dinner table. And Clara, who had spent 7 years learning her stepmother the way sailors learn the sea, lay awake that night with dread sitting on her chest like a stone. sweetness in Harriet, was always the sound of a trap being oiled. But knowing a trap is coming and knowing where it will bite are two very different things. Ashworth Park at night was something out of a dream. Clara had never seen it, and no telling could have prepared her. Lights blazed in 40 windows. Carriages rolled up the long drive in a glittering river. Inside, the great hall rose 2 stories to a painted ceiling, and the ballroom beyond it glowed candlelight on gold, on silk, on the polished floor where 100 guests were already turning to music. Vivian, in new rose-pink silk that had cost more than the household's monthly accounts, swept in like a queen. Clara came behind in her gray, the same made-over gray, for the promised dress had never appeared, and that too, Clara would understand later, was part of the design. Let her come drab. Let her come shabby. Let the contrast do its work. For the first hour, the trap did not show itself. Harriet was everywhere, brilliant, laughing, steering Vivian from introduction to introduction like a general moving her finest regiment. Clara stood at the edge of it all, near the tall windows, doing what she did best. Being invisible. Except that she was not. Twice, from across that vast bright room, she felt it, a gaze finding her through the crowd, steady and sure. And when the second dance ended and the couples cleared, the crowd stirred and heads began to turn, because the Duke of Ashworth was crossing his own ballroom. Not toward the Countess by the fireplace, not toward the Baronet's daughters in their diamonds, not toward Vivian, who had already begun her curtsy. He walked the full length of that floor, past every rank and every fortune, and stopped in front of the young woman in gray by the window. And in the ringing quiet, because half the room had stopped talking outright, he bowed and said, "Miss Whitfield, I believe the next is a waltz. Would you do me the honor?" 100 people watched Clara Whitfield stand frozen for one heartbeat. 100 people watched her lift her chin, that same small lift with which she had once answered a question at a dinner table, and lay her hand in the hand of the Duke of Ashworth. Whatever else happened in her life after, Clara never forgot that waltz. She knew the steps. Her mother had taught her, a lifetime ago, humming the tune, a little girl's feet on her slippers. But no one had told her what it would be to dance it, the room turning to gold around her, the music lifting like a tide, and his hand steady at her back as though nothing in the world could fall while it was there. "Everyone is staring," she murmured. "Yes," said the Duke gravely. "At my dancing, it is said to be adequate at best." The laugh escaped her before she could catch it, bright and real, the laugh of a girl who had not laughed freely in 7 years. And Nathaniel, Duke of Ashworth, watched her laugh in the candlelight, and his heart, that careful, guarded, twice-locked instrument, quietly gave up the fight. "Miss Whitfield," he said low, only for her, "when this evening is over, there is a question I intend to ask you, a rather more important one than the schools." Clara's breath stopped. The room turned, the candles blurred to stars. "Then I hope, Your Grace," she managed, "that I shall be allowed to answer." "Madam," he said, "I should like to see anyone stop you." The music ended. The room applauded the dancers and more than the dancers. And at the edge of the ballroom, still smiling her flawless smile, Harriet Whitfield watched her every plan burn and set her own music in motion. It happened at midnight, at the supper interval, with the precision of a thing rehearsed. The guests had flowed toward the supper room in a bright chattering current. Clara, floating somewhere above the earth, had gone with Vivian to the ladies' retiring room, where maids took wraps and mended hems, and the ladies left their fans and little evening bags among the powder boxes. Vivian had been almost kind on the walk down the corridor. Clara, drunk on the evening, let herself believe it. It was as they returned to the supper room that the cry rang out. "My bracelet!" Vivian stood stricken by the long table, her wrist bare, her eyes brimming on command. "Mama, my diamond bracelet, it's gone." The current of guests ebbed and stopped. Harriet was at her daughter's side in a moment, all concern. The bracelet, the famous bracelet, Vivian's late father's last gift, diamonds irreplaceable, the words moved through the crowd like wind through wheat. Servants were summoned. The retiring room must be searched, the corridor, the... Perhaps, said Harriet in a voice that carried beautifully, the ladies' bags might be looked at. Ours as well, of course. All of them, so that no innocent person need lie under suspicion. It was perfectly done, reasonable, fair. Her own bag was opened first, nothing naturally, then Vivian's. Then, one by one, the little beaded bags of the ladies nearest, each opened with apologies and laughter, the whole thing almost a parlor game. Then a footman lifted a worn gray reticule, and Clara's blood turned to ice because it was hers, and because she suddenly, perfectly, understood the shape of the evening. "That one belongs to my stepdaughter," said Harriet, and let the smallest pause fall. "Open it." The footman opened it. His face changed. From the shabby gray bag in front of 100 of the county's finest, he drew a river of diamonds that caught the candlelight and threw it across every staring face. The sound the crowd made was low and terrible, a single indrawn breath. "Clara," Harriet's voice broke magnificently on the name. Grief, shock, wounded love, a great actress at the summit of her art. "Oh, Clara, after everything, after all these years, how could you?" Clara stood in the center of a widening circle. She looked at the diamonds. She looked at the faces, shocked, avid, already believing, because a story was being told, and it was such a very good story. The shabby, jealous stepsister, the poor widow's charity repaid with theft. She opened her mouth to speak. And nothing came. 7 years closed on her throat like a hand. All those dinners, all those swallowed words, every yes ma'am, every stare at her plate, they rose up together and took her voice precisely when her life depended on it. Her lips moved. Air moved. Nothing more. To 100 watching strangers, it looked like guilt discovering it has no answer. "I didn't." It came out at last as barely a whisper, lost in the murmur of the crowd. "I never." "Please." Harriet raised a trembling hand, mercy itself. "Please, no scene. She is my late husband's daughter, and I will not see her shamed further, whatever she has done. We will deal with this at home as a family. Your Grace," and here she turned, black silk and dignity, to the master of the house, "I beg you to forgive us for disturbing your beautiful evening. We will take our leave." Nathaniel had forced his way through the crowd in time to see the diamonds lifted from the gray bag. He stood 10 feet from Clara, and for one moment their eyes met across the whispering circle. "Wait," he said. The crowd hushed. A duke's words still ruled his own house. "This is not Miss Whitfield. Tell me what happened." And Clara looked at him, at the one person on earth who had told her she might always speak freely, and her throat closed, and her eyes filled, and no words came. Because a courtroom of 100 staring faces is not a lane by a mill stream, and some cages, once grown into the bone, do not open merely because the door is called unlocked. Harriet's hand settled on her arm like a manacle dressed as comfort. "You see how she is, Your Grace," Harriet said softly, sadly. "She has these silences. She has had them for years since her poor father died. We manage her as best we can." It was masterful. In 11 words she had turned the crime into a condition, 7 years of cruelty into 7 years of patience, and the Duke's own tenderness into evidence. They led Clara out through the parted crowd, past the Countess, past the Colonel who had chuckled "Well said" by George, past 100 lowered eyes and behind the fan whispers. At the great doors she made herself look back once. Nathaniel stood alone in the middle of his golden ballroom, the crowd whispering around him like a tide, his face unreadable, his hands at his sides slowly closing into fists. The doors shut. And in the carriage rolling home through the dark, Harriet Whitfield finally stopped smiling. She looked across at Clara, silent and shaking in her corner, and spoke in the low, pleasant tone of a woman remarking on the weather. "The Framptons," she said, "will expect us within the week." They locked her in. Not with drama. Harriet did nothing with drama when no audience was present. The morning after the ball, Clara's shoes were taken away to be mended. The key to the little room at the end of the corridor turned from the outside softly while she slept. Her meals came up on a tray, carried by a frightened kitchen maid who had clearly been forbidden to speak and who could not meet Clara's eyes. Through her narrow window, Clara watched the ordinary world go on below, the gardener raking the paths, the carrier's cart at the gate. Somewhere out there, 10 miles away, stood Ashworth Park and a man who had promised her a question. "He will come," she told herself the first day. He knows me, he will come." But the first day ended, and the second, and no one came. What Clara could not see, and what you must now be told, is what Harriet Whitfield did with those 2 days. Because Harriet understood something that cleverer villains often forget. It is not enough to imprison a woman's body. If the work is to last, you must also poison every road that leads to her. And the most important road of all led to Ashworth Park. The Duke had not slept. He had stood in his ballroom while the last carriages rolled away, while the servants snuffed the candles 100 by 100, and the great house sank back into its accustomed silence. And in that silence he had gone over the evening the way a magistrate goes over evidence, again and again, and every pass ended in the same 2 pictures. The diamonds pouring out of that worn gray bag. And Clara's face above them, white, stricken and silent. Understand him fairly. He did not believe she was a thief. Everything he knew of her cried out against it, and he had seen with his own eyes how neatly the scene had played, how ready the mother's speech had been, how the bags had been opened in an order that led, like a path of stones, straight to the gray one. A man did not need to be a magistrate to smell the theater in it. But there was a small, cold voice in Nathaniel, and it did not speak of diamonds at all. It spoke with his mother's accent. "People perform," it said. "Everyone performs for a man with your fortune. The little scene in the library, the walks by the stream, so easily fallen into, the way she said exactly the things your heart was hungry to hear. Silenced, unseen, caged, was any of it true, or was it the one performance in the county clever enough to be aimed at you? You, who could never resist a silence. She read you like one of her borrowed books." He fought the voice. All the next day he fought it, and he was drafting a letter to Whitfield Hall, the 3rd draft. The words would not come right when his butler announced a visitor. Mr. Josiah Crane, attorney at law, man of business to the late Mr. Whitfield and now to his widow. Crane came in washing his dry hands around each other, a thin man of careful bows, whose eyes touched everything in the room and settled on nothing. He was so very sorry to intrude. He came on a painful errand, a matter of conscience, your grace, and he begged that what he was about to share would be treated with discretion, for the sake of a family already suffering. Then he laid an envelope on the Duke's desk, as though it burned his fingers. "Mrs. Whitfield felt, and I concurred, your grace, that after the unhappy events of Saturday evening you were owed the truth, however much it pains the family to expose it." Inside the envelope was a letter. The paper was cheap, the hand feminine, small and slanting. It was addressed to a Miss Fanny Price, care of a coaching inn in Bristol, and it was signed at the bottom of the 2nd page, Clara. Nathaniel read it with a stillness that gradually became terrible. "Dearest Fanny," the letter ran, "you ask how my great project proceeds, and I answer, better than even we hoped. The man is a fortress, but every fortress has its gate, and I found his within a fortnight. He was made mute as a boy, kept from table, hidden by his fine mother. The whole county whispers of it if one knows where to ask. So you will laugh to hear what I have made of myself. A poor silenced creature, forbidden to speak at dinner, invisible in my own house. I feed him his own sad story with my face, and he cannot look away. The stepmother serves my purpose better than she knows. The harsher she plays, the more his pity swells. Men of his kind do not marry for love, Fanny. They marry to rescue. And I intend to be rescued all the way to Ashworth Park. There was more, a line about patience until the settlements are signed, a jest about gray dresses being an investment. Nathaniel did not finish it. He set the pages down on the desk, very precisely, and looked at them for a long time. Where did this come from? His voice was quiet. Found in Miss Whitfield's room, Your Grace, in the search that followed the incident with the bracelet, sewn into a mattress seam. Crane's hands washed each other. Mrs. Whitfield was loath to send it. She said, better His Grace think us thieves' kin than know this shame. But I persuaded her that a gentleman of your standing was entitled to protect himself. There are, I fear, a delicate pause, other letters. The small, cold voice inside Nathaniel said with his mother's satisfaction, you see, I told you, everyone performs. He was made mute as a boy, kept from table, hidden by his fine mother. His secret, his one confession made on a muddy lane to the only person he had ever trusted with it, and here it was, retold in a stranger's mocking hand, currency in a scheme. Only 2 living people knew that story. He had told one of them 12 days ago. That was the blow, you see, not the diamonds, not even the deception itself. It was the thought that the single truest hour of his life had been the bait. Thank you, Mr. Crane, said the Duke of Ashworth, in a voice with nothing left in it. You may tell Mrs. Whitfield her family's affairs are safe from me. Good day. Crane bowed himself out, and if there was a small dry gleam behind his eyes, the Duke did not see it, because the Duke was standing at the window with his back to the room, looking out over the gardens and seeing nothing at all. He gave his orders within the hour. The knocker came off the great front door. The traveling coach was made ready. His Grace was going up to London, indefinitely. Now, you and I know what Nathaniel could not. We know the letter was a forgery, and we may as well see how it was made, for it shows the quality of the enemy. Harriet Whitfield had kept samples of Clara's hand for years, the household accounts, the copied menus, all that dutiful invisible labor turned at the last into a weapon. The slanting script was Crane's clerk's work, patient and paid for, and the secret at the letter's heart, the Duke's own hidden boyhood. Vivian had brought that home. She had followed to the mill stream more than once. Sound carries up a hill, and what she overheard, weeping with jealousy, her mother had received like a general receiving powder and shot. Harriet had built the one lie perfectly measured to the one man, a lie that used his deepest truth as its proof. Clara knew none of this. Locked in the little room, she knew only what she could count, the days. On the 3rd morning, the door was unlocked, and Harriet stood in it with a folded traveling cloak over her arm and a face of gentle, immovable sorrow. Her public face, worn now even in private, which meant the performance had entered its final act. You will want to make yourself tidy, she said. You have been unwell and you are going into the country to rest. My cousins keep an excellent house. Quiet, very quiet, you will feel at home. She laid the cloak on the bed, and with it a pair of Clara's shoes, returned at last for the journey. The carriage comes Friday morning. Clara stood at the window with her back to it, and asked the only question left. Does he know? Her voice was rusty with disuse. Does he think, what does he think of me? And Harriet Whitfield paused in the doorway. Kindness would have been silence. She chose otherwise, as she always chose. His Grace closed Ashworth Park on Tuesday, she said. He has gone to London, they say, for the season, perhaps for the year. He left no message. A small, sympathetic tilt of the head. Men of his rank amuse themselves in the country, Clara. It is what the country is for. Surely you did not imagine you were something more. The door closed, the key turned softly. And Clara Whitfield stood alone in the little cold room, 3 days from Yorkshire, and watched the last light go out on the road to Ashworth, and did not weep, because there is a floor below weeping, a still gray place where the heart simply sits down. She had been silenced for 7 years. Now at last they had found a way to silence her forever, politely, respectably, with a folded cloak and a country rest cure, and a carriage ordered for Friday morning. And no one was coming. That was Wednesday. But in the servants' hall below, an old woman was untying her apron with shaking hands. An old woman who had watched this house for 30 years, who had held her tongue through every one of them, and who had just decided at the age of 61 that she was done being silent. Her name was Mrs. Hobbs. Clara was still awake at midnight when she heard the key. It turned slowly, carefully, the way a key turns when the hand holding it is afraid of the sound. Clara sat up in the dark, heart-pounding, certain it was Harriet, some new refinement of cruelty, some midnight rehearsal for Friday. But the shape that slipped through the door, shielding a single candle with one worn hand, was small and round-shouldered and gray-haired, and it closed the door behind itself and stood against it, breathing hard. "Mrs. Hobbs." "Hush now, Miss Clara. For the love of heaven, hush." The old housekeeper set the candle on the washstand with hands that would not hold steady. 30 years that woman had run Whitfield Hall. She had been there before Clara was born. She had served Clara's mother and dressed her for her wedding and closed her eyes at the end. And in all the 7 dark years since, she had done her work and lowered her gaze and said nothing, one more silence in a house built of them. Now she stood with her back against the door of Clara's prison, and her old face was wet, and the words came out of her like water through a broken dam. "I heard where they mean to send you Friday, the Framptons." She said the name the way one names a disease. "And I told myself, Martha Hobbs, you have held your tongue for 7 years because you are old and alone, and a place is life itself at your age, and if you hold it 3 days more, that child is gone where no truth will ever reach her. So it is tonight, Miss Clara. God forgive me that it wasn't 7 years ago." Clara was out of bed, wrapping the shawl around her shoulders, suddenly cold in a way that had nothing to do with the night air. "Mrs. Hobbs, what truth?" The old woman looked at her for a long moment. "I was in your father's study that night," she said. "Before the household woke, I was the one who found him." She told it plainly in a low voice, while the candle burned between them, and Clara stood without moving, afraid that if she stirred the telling would stop. Mrs. Hobbs rose at 4:30, winter and summer. She had done it all her life. That morning she had seen light under the study door and thought the master had fallen asleep over his papers again and gone in to mend the fire. Mr. Whitfield was slumped across the desk, and on the desk under his hand lay a letter begun and unfinished, "My dearest Clara," in his own dear scrawl. "I heard her on the stairs," Mrs. Hobbs whispered. "Her step, I'd know it anywhere, quick and light like a cat's. And Miss Clara, I cannot tell you what came over me, but I knew the way you know a storm before the first drop, that whatever was written on that desk must not fall into her hands. I snatched at the letter. It tore right across under his poor hand. I had the top half in my apron pocket when she came through that door, and the bottom half." The old woman's face crumpled. "The bottom half stayed on the desk, and she gathered up every paper in that room before the doctor was even sent for, and that evening the study grate was full of ash. I raked it out myself. I know what burned paper is." Clara turned, knelt by her bed, and drew out the wooden box. When she opened the prayer book and slid the torn half-letter from the binding, Mrs. Hobbs made a small sound, half sob and half laughter, and pressed her hand to her mouth. "You found it, 7 years, and you found it. You put it there. Where else was it safe? Not on me. She had my room searched twice that first year, oh yes, very quietly, but I knew. Not in the house where she counted the spoons, but your mother's prayer book in your own keeping. She never touched a thing of your mother's. She hated her too much to touch her. Mrs. Hobbs reached out one crooked finger and touched the torn edge of the letter. I meant to tell you when you came of age, then when you were stronger, then when it was safer. There is always a reason to stay silent, Miss Clara. That is how they win. Clara's voice came out very quiet. The letter says he had been to Crane, that he knew what she, and there it ends. What did he know, Mrs. Hobbs? What was in those papers? And Mrs. Hobbs told her the rest. That last evening, while his new wife dressed for dinner, Mr. Whitfield had called his old housekeeper into the study. The man she had served for 30 years, gray-faced and grim and gentler than she had ever seen him. He had asked her to look after his daughter. Whatever comes, Martha, look after Clara. And when she had asked, frightened, what was to come, he had patted her hand and said, I have been a blind fool, but it is mended now. I have seen the accounts with my own eyes. I have been to Crane's office, and it is signed, all signed and witnessed and safe with Crane, and tomorrow everything will be set right. Signed, Clara repeated, a new will. A new will. He said the words himself, standing where you stand now. Everything set down proper, this house, and your poor mother's fortune that was always meant for you, every penny and every stone of it. The old woman's voice hardened. Because that was what he had seen, Miss Clara. That was what broke him. Your mother's jewels, I dressed her, child. I knew every piece gone, one by one, all those years, to dealers in Bristol. Her pearls, her rings, the sapphire necklace. She looked at Clara steadily. You knew that necklace the night you were 13. You stood up at that table in front of all her fine new friends and you named it. Clara stood very still, and 7 years turned slowly over and showed their underside. That is why, she breathed. The rule, it was never manners, it was never even punishment. It was fear, Miss Clara. From that night, you were the one soul at her table who could look at what she wore, at what she sold, at what she spent, and say out loud where it came from. A child who names things is a danger to a thief. So the child was silenced, and they called it discipline, and your poor father was made to half believe it, and the world was made to wholly believe it. Mrs. Hobbs shook her old head. 7 years I have watched you sit at that table with your lips shut, and known why, and eaten my dinner. I will answer for it in the next world, but I'll answer for the other thing first. What other thing? The will, child, follow it. He signed it safe with Crane, and yet when Crane stood up in this house and read a will, it was the old one, everything to her. The housekeeper leaned close, and her whisper dropped lower still. Now, twice a year, regular as quarter days, that dry stick of a lawyer visits this house, and twice a year there are words behind the morning room door. I don't listen at doors, Miss Clara, but a tray must be carried in and a tray must be carried out, and I have ears in my head. The last time in spring his voice for once was the loud one. He said, My terms have changed, madam, he said. You forget what I keep in my strong box. And she said, Mrs. Hobbs closed her eyes, remembering. She said, and you forget, Josiah, that the paper hangs you as high as me. The candle fluttered. In the silence, Clara heard her own blood. The will still existed, burned from the study, buried at the reading, but alive, locked in a lawyer's strongbox, kept not from honesty, but as one thief's leash upon another. Proof. Real, signed, witnessed proof 10 miles away, in the town, in Josiah Crane's office. Mrs. Hobbs, Clara said slowly, tomorrow, at first light, can you get word? I can do better than word. I'll go myself. Ashworth Park first, and if His Grace has truly gone to London, then I have a little put by, and there is a mail coach from the George at noon, and I am not too old to sit in a coach. The old woman drew herself up to her full small height, and for a moment Clara saw the woman who had run a great house for 30 years. He must hear it from someone who was under this roof. Letters can be called forgeries, as I gather letters have been. But I will stand in front of that young man, and I will tell him what I found and what I kept, and what I heard, and let him look in my face while I say it. For the first time in 4 days, Something lit in Clara's chest, small and fierce as the candle flame. It lasted exactly as long as it took Mrs. Hobbs to open the door. Harriet Whitfield was standing in the corridor. She was in her dressing gown, a candle of her own in her hand, and how long she had been there neither of them would ever know. Her face was perfectly calm. That was the terrible thing, no rage, no shock. Only calculation, moving behind her eyes swift as beads on a wire, and then the small, cold settling of a decision made. "Mrs. Hobbs," she said pleasantly, "you will pack your box tonight. You leave this house at dawn without wages owed and without a character. 30 years of references gone in a night's foolishness. At your age, what a pity." She turned to Clara, standing frozen in the doorway of her prison, and smiled, and dropped the mask one final time, because among the three of them there was no longer any audience worth performing for. "And you, my dear, are no longer leaving Friday. The carriage comes tomorrow, at first light." The door was pulled shut. The key turned no softness now, and the quick light step went away down the corridor, and the house settled back into its long-practiced silence. But Harriet Whitfield, who had not made a mistake in 7 years, had just made 2 in one night. She had given the truth a deadline. And she had put Martha Hobbs outside her walls, an old woman with nothing left to lose, a little money put by, and 30 years of witness burning in her chest like a lamp. They came for Clara at first light. There was no scene. Harriet did not permit scenes. There was only the gray dawn and the traveling cloak laid out, and a hired woman Clara had never seen before, broad, silent, with a face like a closed door, who stood in the corridor while Clara dressed and did not once look away. Down the stairs, through the hall of her father's house, past the drawing room where her mother's portrait had hung until the year it quietly vanished. The servants had found reasons to be elsewhere. That too was arranged. Only the little kitchen maid stood at the green baize door with her apron pressed to her mouth, and her eyes as Clara passed were the eyes of someone watching a funeral. The carriage waited on the drive, blinds drawn. Harriet stood beside it in the cold half-dark, dressed and composed at 6 in the morning, as she had been dressed and composed at 5 in the morning once before, 7 years ago. Clara stopped on the step. She turned, and one last time in front of the hired woman and the coachman and the pale sky, she tried. "You know this is not rest." Her voice was low, but it did not break. "You know what that house is. Whatever you tell them, whatever paper you have bought, you know, and God knows, and my father knew. That is why he—" "Manners, Clara." 2 words, soft as falling snow. And Harriet Whitfield smiled, the jewelry smile, the one she had worn for 7 years of dinners, and gestured gracefully toward the open carriage door, as a hostess shows a guest in to supper. The hired woman's hand closed on Clara's arm, the door shut, the blinds were already down. And as the carriage rolled out through the gates of her father's house, Clara Whitfield sat in the swaying dark and made herself a promise. Whatever came, whatever they called her and wherever they put her, she would not let them teach her again that her voice changed nothing. Because once, one time in 7 years it had. A man had asked her a question at a dinner table, and she had answered, and the world had cracked open an inch. She held on to that inch in the dark. Some time later, an hour, perhaps more, the carriage slowed at a crossroads and turned. Clara, who had walked and studied that country all her quiet life, felt the turn and went cold. Through the gap at the edge of the blind, a thin blade of morning sun lay across her knees. It lay on the wrong side. Yorkshire was north, they were driving south. 10 miles away, an old woman was walking. They had put Martha Hobbs out at dawn, as promised, her wages unpaid, her box on the gravel, 30 years closed behind a door that did not look back. She had stood there a moment in the cold, a small gray figure with everything she owned at her feet. Then she had carried the box to the lodge, left it with the gatekeeper's wife, a good girl, one of hers, trained in her own kitchen, and set out on the Ashworth Road on foot. 10 miles. She was 61 years old, and her knees had been speaking to her for a decade, and it had begun, softly, to rain. She walked it anyway, past the mill stream where two silenced people had once found their voices, up the long hill where her breath failed and she stood a while bent, holding a gatepost, an old woman alone in the rain, and then straightened and went on, because there was a girl in a carriage on the North Road and there was no one else. All those years of holding her tongue had gathered themselves, mile by mile, into something with weight, something that pushed her up that hill from behind like a hand at her back. It was past 10 when she came at last up the great avenue of Ashworth Park, soaked through, mud to the shins, gray hair straggled under a ruined bonnet. And stopped. The traveling coach stood at the foot of the steps, 4 horses, luggage strapped and corded, and coming down between the stone lions, gloved and grim, dressed for London and a long absence, came the Duke of Ashworth. A footman moved to head her off. "Now then, mother, round the back with you. This is no morning for—" "Your Grace." Her voice cracked across the gravel, rusty and enormous, the voice that had commanded kitchens for 30 years. "Your Grace, I am Martha Hobbs, housekeeper of Whitfield Hall as was until this dawn, and if you get into that coach before you hear me, you will regret it every day that is left to you." Silence on the great steps. 2 footmen had hold of her arms. The butler was already murmuring apologies, and the Duke of Ashworth stood by the open door of his coach and looked down at the small, drenched, furious old woman being dragged backward across his drive, an old woman who had walked out of the very house he was running from, and something in her face stopped him. It was not madness, and it was not begging. It was 30 years of held tongue, finally let go. "Release her," he said, and then quietly the words that were becoming the compass of his life, though he did not know it yet. "Let her speak." They did not go inside. She would not spare the time. She stood in the rain at the foot of his steps and delivered herself of 7 years, while the horses stamped and the servants stood like statues and pretended not to hear. He listened with a face like winter. When she paused for breath, he said, in a voice she was meant to be frightened by, "You should know, before you go further, that I have seen a letter in Miss Whitfield's hand. A letter that explains everything you describe as one long performance, arranged for my benefit. It was found in her room. I am told there are others." Found in her room. Mrs. Hobbs wiped rain from her face with a wet hand and looked up at him and did not step back, and her voice when it came was almost pitying. "Your Grace, I kept that room. 7 years I kept it, and I will tell you what was in it. A wooden box with a ribbon, a pressed flower, and her mother's prayer book, and I could name you every hairpin besides. And I will tell you who searched that room the night of your ball, and whose lawyer came calling on you after, all conscience and clean hands. But never mind the letter. Answer me one thing, Your Grace, and then put me out of your gates if you like." She drew a breath. "You were at that supper table. You saw them pull the diamonds out of her bag in front of 100 people. If she is what that letter says, a schemer, an actress, a girl who has played a long, deep game for a duke's fortune, then that was the moment her whole game hung by a thread. So tell me, what did she do? Did she weep prettily? Did she turn those gray eyes on you and produce something perfect?" The old woman shook her head slowly. She stood there and her voice died in her throat, and she could not defend herself with 100 people watching. "I have it from every servant who stood in that room. And that, Your Grace, is the one thing in this world that cannot be performed, because it is the very thing a performer does not have. Schemers do not fall silent. Schemers speak beautifully." The rain fell. The Duke of Ashworth stood very still. Schemers speak beautifully, and the letter had spoken beautifully. Fluent, witty, perfectly pitched to its reader, every sentence finding its mark like a thrown knife. He had read it as proof of Clara's cunning. He had never once thought to read it as proof of its authors. Clara had needed 12 days and a muddy lane to say one true thing to him, haltingly, with her voice cracking on her mother's name. The girl in that letter had never hesitated in her life. "The secret," he said, and his voice was no longer meant to frighten anyone. It had gone quiet and young. There was a thing in that letter that only one living person had been told, on a lane, with no one near. One near. Mrs. Hobbs almost smiled, grim as a headstone. "Your Grace sound runs up that valley like water runs down it, and I will tell you what the stable lad told me the very day of that walk of yours. Miss Vivian came home by the ridge path with her hem in ruins and her face like thunder, and went straight in to her mother, and the sitting-room door was shut the better part of an hour. She let that sit, then finished, softly. They did not forge that letter out of air, Your Grace. They forged it out of you. That is what that woman does. She finds the true thing in a person and she turns it and she hands it back as a weapon. She has done it to that child for 7 years. She did it to her poor father. And this week, saving your presence, she did it to a duke." And then she told him the last of it, the part he could not have guessed. The study at dawn, the torn letter, the prayer book. The old will read aloud by Crane and the new one signed and witnessed days before, safe in Crane's own strongbox, safe as a knife at 2 throats. The mother's fortune, sold south to Bristol stone by stone. The necklace and the child of 13 who had named it at dinner in front of company, and the rule that fell on her the very next morning and was called Ever After Manners. Motive, that was the word that finished it, the magistrate's word, moving all the pieces into their true places at last. The letter had told him Clara schemed for a fortune. The truth was the precise reverse, turned like everything else that woman touched. The fortune was Clara's, and the scheme was 7 years old, and its whole design, from the first silenced dinner to the carriage on the road this morning, was that no one should ever hear her say so. He had asked her one question at a table, and the house of lies had begun to shake from that moment, until they forged one letter, and he, of all men on earth, had chosen the beautiful speech over the silence. "She told me the cage was wrapped in ribbon," he thought, "and I handed her back to it." Simmons. His voice cracked across the gravel like a whip. The whole frozen tableau of servants leapt to life. "The bays saddled now, Harding and the 2 grooms with me, armed. Mrs. Hobbs goes inside, fire and dry clothes and hot food, and she is to be treated as what she is." He was already down the steps, stripping off his London gloves, the bravest soul in this county. The Yorkshire road runs by the crossroads at Hatton. A closed carriage, black, 2 hours ahead of us at most. They rode out of Ashworth Park at a flat gallop through the rain, the coach and London standing abandoned at the steps behind them. They caught the carriage a mile past Hatton Crossroads, black, closed, blinds down, dark horses steaming, exactly as described. The grooms swung wide to head the team. The coachman, finding a duke's face at his wheel and a duke's voice ordering him to stand, stood. Nathaniel was off his horse before it fully stopped, at the carriage door, wrenching it open on its hinges. Empty. A traveling rug folded, a corded trunk, and on the seat squarely in the middle where it could not be missed, a single sheet of paper folded once. He knew before he touched it. He knew by the neatness of it. The coachman was already babbling above him, hired in town, paid double, told to drive the North Road to Yorkshire, steady-like, and ask no questions and stop for no one. Nathaniel unfolded the paper. On it, in a smooth, elegant, feminine hand, was written one line. "Manners, Your Grace." For a moment, standing in the rain with that single mocking line in his hand, Nathaniel felt the ground tilt under him. She had foreseen everything. The empty decoy carriage rolling north with its blinds down. The note left where only a pursuer would find it. She had known Mrs. Hobbs would reach him, known he would ride, known which road, and she was hours ahead on some other road entirely, with Clara in her keeping. And England is wide, and a young woman with no name on any list can vanish into it like a stone into the sea. Then the tilting stopped, because Harriet Whitfield had made one arrogant assumption too many. She had assumed the game was speed. It was not. It was knowledge. And thanks to a 61-year-old woman with ruined knees, Nathaniel now knew where the knowledge was kept. "Turn about," he said to his men, swinging back into the saddle. "We ride to town, to the offices of Mr. Josiah Crane." Josiah Crane had built his life on a single principle: always hold something over everyone. It had served him for 30 years. It had made a country attorney rich. And at 4 o'clock that afternoon, with the Duke of Ashworth standing in his private office, rain-soaked and terrible, with the door shut and 2 grooms outside it, that principle turned in his hand like a knife seized by the blade. "I shall say this once and plainly," the Duke said. He had not sat down. 7 years ago, Edward Whitfield executed a new will in this office, signed and witnessed. Days later he was dead, and you stood up in his house and read out the old one. The new will did not burn with his other papers because you kept it. You have been keeping it over Mrs. Whitfield's head and raising your price these 7 years. My terms have changed, madam. You forget what I keep in my strong box. Your own words, Mr. Crane, in the Whitfield morning room, this spring, before a witness who will swear to them. Crane's dry hands had stopped washing each other. That, in Crane, was what shouting was in other men. Your Grace has been listening to servants' gossip, an old dismissed woman with a grievance. Suppressing a testament, the Duke went on as though he had not spoken, is a felony. Conspiring to steal an inheritance is a felony. The letter you carried to my house, a forgery in a hired hand, built on stolen confidences, makes you party to a fraud upon a peer, and I will leave you to imagine how the courts of this country enjoy those. And this morning, Mr. Crane, a young woman was taken from her home by force, against her will, on the strength of papers I suspect you drafted. If that ship sails, if that girl is lost, it will not be fraud, sir. Men hang for what it will be." Silence. The clock on the wall ticked with a small dry sound, like the lawyer's own heart. "You have one road out of this room that does not end in a courtroom," the Duke said quietly. "The strongbox, the will, the name of the ship, now. And when this comes before the magistrates, and it will, you will appear not as conspirator but as witness, the honest man of business who kept his client's true testament safe for 7 years against the day it could be produced. I am offering to let you tell that lie, Mr. Crane, because I have no time to make you tell the truth. Choose." Josiah Crane looked at the Duke for 3 full seconds, a survivor's arithmetic moving behind his dry eyes, weighing 30 years of leverage against 1 afternoon of ruin. Then he took a key from his watch chain and knelt before the iron strongbox in the corner. The will lay in an envelope of oiled paper, sealed, endorsed in a clerk's fair hand. Testament of Edward Whitfield-esque. In the matter of my daughter Clara. Nathaniel broke the seal and read it standing, while the lawyer watched him the way a man watches his own house burn. It was all there, all of it, in the plain, heartbroken language of a man setting 7 years of blindness right in a single evening. Whitfield Hall and the lands to his daughter Clara. Her mother's fortune, every pound of it listed, every jewel named, with a bitter little clause acknowledging those pieces already sold and directing their value repaid to her out of the estate. To my wife Harriet, an annuity, provided she trouble my daughter no further. The guardianship of my daughter until her majority to my old friend Colonel Harrow. And then, at the end, above the signatures and seals, one sentence that was not legal language at all, that the clerk had plainly taken down exactly as the dying man dictated it. And I direct that my daughter Clara shall keep her own counsel, her own fortune, and her own voice, which last I permitted to be taken from her at my own table, to my lasting shame. Nathaniel read that sentence twice. When he looked up, his eyes made even Crane step back. The ship. The Meridian, Crane's voice had gone thin. "Out of Bristol for Halifax. Mrs. Whitfield wrote to me 2 days ago, funds and a passage to be arranged, a female companion engaged, a physician's certificate prepared. Nervous prostration, removal abroad for her health, guardian's authority." He swallowed. "The certificate is signed by Dr. Meeks. Dr. Meeks, Your Grace, has owed Mrs. Whitfield money for 6 years. I can testify to that as well." "When does she sail?" "This evening's tide." Nathaniel was already at the door, the will inside his coat, when he turned back one last time. "Get your hat, Mr. Crane. You are coming with us." "Honest witnesses," he said, with a smile that had nothing in it Crane wished to look at, "do not leave one's sight." They rode into Bristol as the light was going, down through the smoke and clamor of the port, the streets narrowing, the masts rising ahead of them out of the dusk like a leafless forest, and the smell of tar and tide coming up to meet them. Somewhere a bell was ringing the hour. The tide, a waterman shouted when they called down to him, was making. Ships would warp out within the hour. And at the end of the long quay, at the foot of the Meridian's gangway, a knot of people had gathered, because a young woman in a traveling cloak was refusing, calmly and clearly and very loudly, to walk up it. Clara had made her stand at the bottom of the gangway, and she was using the only weapon she had ever been forbidden. "My name is Clara Whitfield." Her voice rang down the quay, over the gulls and the creak of moorings, cracked, unpracticed, and absolutely unmistakable. "I am being sent aboard this ship against my will. I am not ill and I am not mad, I am inconvenient. Captain, look at me, sir. Do I speak to you like a madwoman?" The captain of the Meridian stood at the head of his gangway, caught in every seaman's oldest dread. Trouble on the shore side. Below him, the broad hired woman gripped Clara's arm and repeated that the young lady was disturbed, that the young lady said such things, that it was all in the papers if the captain would only. "The papers are here." Harriet Whitfield came through the crowd like a blade through cloth, black-gloved, magnificent, holding out a folded certificate. Her voice was pitched for the whole quay, patient, wounded, infinitely reasonable, the voice that had run a county's dinner tables for 7 years. "Captain, forgive us this scene. I am her guardian. My physician's certificate, my late husband's will naming my authority, her passage paid. My stepdaughter suffers from delusions of persecution, of stolen inheritances, of wicked stepmothers." A sad, gracious little smile at the crowd, inviting them into the joke. "She has been managed at home for years, as half the county will tell you, now aboard before the tide." "Do not," said Clara, low and shaking, to the captain, "make me part of your cargo, sir. I will say it once more before all these people, so that every soul here has heard it and may be called to swear to it. I am taken against my will." And there it hung, one girl's word against a widow's papers on a darkening quay with the tide making. The captain looked from the certificate to the girl. The crowd murmured. The hired woman pulled. Harriet, sensing the balance, gave the smallest gracious nod, bored her, and the sailors moved. "Captain." The word came down the quay like a cannon shot. The crowd split, and out of the dusk, scattering porters and coils of rope, rode 4 horsemen with a shut carriage rattling behind them, and the man in front was down from the saddle while his horse still moved, and the quayside lanterns caught his face, and a dockhand who had once seen him at assizes said, quite audibly, into the silence, "That's Ashworth, that's the Duke." Nathaniel walked through the parted crowd without hurrying, because there was no longer any need to hurry, and stopped between Clara and the gangway. He looked at her first, one look, half a second. "Do not be afraid. I know everything," and Clara's knees nearly failed her, not from weakness but from the sheer removal of 7 years' weight. Then he turned to Harriet Whitfield. "Madam, you will instruct your woman to release Miss Whitfield's arm." Harriet's composure did not crack. Even then, it did not crack. She had rebuilt her position in the time it took him to cross the quay, and her voice came smooth as ever, regretful, reasonable, addressed as much to the murmuring crowd as to him. "Your Grace, this is painful beyond words. Whatever this poor child has told you, whatever an embittered, dismissed servant has told you, the law in this matter is perfectly clear. I am her guardian by her father's own testament. Her passage is lawful, her certificate is signed, and no rank in England, Your Grace, stands above the law." She let it ring, that last phrase, fine and unanswerable, and lifted her chin. "The law is on my side." "No, madam." Nathaniel reached into his coat and drew out a folded document, aged 7 years in a lawyer's strongbox, and held it up so the lantern light fell full upon the seals. "The law is now in her hands." And he read it to the key. The date, 4 days before Edward Whitfield's death. The witnesses, Whitfield Hall, the lands, and the whole of her mother's fortune, to his daughter Clara, the guardianship to Colonel Harrow, the annuity to my wife Harriet, provided she trouble my daughter no further. The crowd's murmur rose around the words like the tide itself. He read the last sentence, her own counsel, her own fortune, and her own voice. And at the foot of the gangway Clara stood with tears running freely down her face, hearing, at the end of everything, in front of 100 strangers, her father say he was sorry. "This testament was suppressed," Nathaniel said, lowering the paper. "The gentleman stepping out of that carriage is the attorney who has kept it these 7 years, and who will be giving the magistrates a full account of how, and of a certain physician's certificate and its price. Captain, you'll want no part of this cargo. Strike the lady's trunk." "Madam," and only now did he turn fully to Harriet, and his voice, which had filled the key, dropped to something quiet and final. "The estate you have spent, the jewels you have sold, the fortune you have stolen, are owed to Miss Whitfield to the last shilling. You are, as of this paper's proving, a guest in her house, and you stand on a public quay before 100 witnesses who have heard all of it." The lanterns hissed, the gulls cried. The crowd, porters, sailors, merchants' wives, the captain on his gangway stood utterly still, every face turned one way. Harriet Whitfield looked around her at all of them, her mouth opened. And for the first time in 7 years, it was Harriet Whitfield who could not find a word to say. They stood facing each other on the quay, in the lantern light, while the world rearranged itself around them. The captain bawling orders, the trunk coming back down the gangway, the crowd pressing and murmuring, Crane being handed down from the carriage into the keeping of 2 grooms like a parcel nobody wanted. And now that there was time, neither of them could find where to begin. It was Clara who spoke first. Of course it was. She had promised herself in a dark carriage that morning that she was done waiting for permission. "You came." Her voice was hoarse from the quay, from the shouting, from 7 years. "They showed you a letter, and it said everything a letter could say, and you came anyway." "No," Nathaniel shook his head slowly. "Do not give me that, for I have not earned it. I read that letter and I believed it, Clara. For 2 days I believed it. I of every man living was shown a silenced woman and a beautiful speech, and I chose the speech." His voice dropped. "An old woman with ruined knees walked 10 miles in the rain to call me a fool to my face. That is the only reason I am standing on this quay. So if you wish to withdraw your good opinion of me, I will understand it." Clara looked up at him for a long moment. This proud, guarded man, standing on a public dock confessing his failure in plain words, with tar smoke drifting through the lantern light between them. "7 years," she said at last. "Everyone believed her. My father believed her for a while, the doctor, the county. 100 people at a ball believed her in the space of 1 minute. She is very good, Nathaniel. It is not a weakness in you that she found your wound. It is what she does she found everyone's." She took a breath, and her mouth curved just slightly for the first time in 4 terrible days. "Besides, you are the only person in the world who ever asked me a question and waited for the answer. You are permitted 1 mistake." "1," he agreed gravely. "I shall try to spend the rest of my life not needing the allowance." It was not an embrace, not there on a public quay, with half of Bristol watching. It was only his two hands taking her two cold hands and holding them while the tide made and the gulls cried. But the dockhand who had recognized the Duke told the story for years afterward, and in his telling it was better than an embrace, and he was right. The law, once it finally had the truth in its hands, moved with surprising speed. The new will was proved within the month. Josiah Crane performed his role to perfection, the faithful attorney who had guarded his late client's true testament through 7 difficult years, and the magistrates thanked him gravely and believed him not at all, and within the season his practice had withered to nothing and he had removed to Liverpool, where nobody knew him, which was the point. Dr. Meeks fared worse. The certificate came out and the debt behind it, and he sold his practice and was not seen again. And Harriet? There was no trial. Clara chose that, and it was the first great decision she made as mistress of her own life, and Nathaniel, whatever it cost him, did not argue. I will not spend the first 3 years of my life in courtrooms proving what 100 people watched her confess with her silence, Clara said. She has lost the house, the fortune, the county, and the story she told about herself for 7 years. There is no sentence longer than that. She was right. The law can take a woman's liberty, but only society can take her audience, and Harriet Whitfield without an audience was a lamp without oil. The invitations stopped in a single week, all of them everywhere at once, in that way the world has. The annuity stood, for the will commanded it, but the will's own words hung over it like a blade, provided she trouble my daughter no further. She removed to a boarding house in Bath, a respectable establishment full of respectable widows, where her fine manners bought her nothing because nobody knew what they had cost, and where, the landlady would later report, she dined every evening in near total silence. Providence, Mrs. Hobbs remarked upon hearing this, has a tidy way with a table. Vivian did not go with her mother. She came to Whitfield Hall instead, alone on foot, 3 days before Harriet left the county, and Clara, watching from the morning-room window, almost refused the door. Almost. Then she remembered a girl on a ridge above a mill stream, weeping with a jealousy she had been bred to like a posture, and she said, "Let her in." Vivian stood in the hall of the house she had queened over for 7 years, and she did not weep or perform or plead, which surprised Clara and perhaps surprised Vivian more. She held out a flat leather case. Inside, on a bed of worn velvet, lay a necklace of pearls and small sapphires. She sold everything else, Vivian said. This she kept. I used to think it was because it was the finest. It wasn't. I think she stopped and started again, and her voice came out stripped of every one of its pretty tones, plain as a servant's. I think she kept it the way soldiers keep a flag, to remember what she'd won, and I helped her, Clara. The mill stream, what I heard, I carried straight home to her, and I knew what she would do with it, the way you always know with mother and always pretend you don't. Her chin came up, her eyes were wet and furious, though not at Clara. You should know it wasn't loyalty, it's just that she never once listened to me either. Not to me, not to anyone. We were all of us furniture. You were the only one she bothered to silence, and do you know, I used to envy you for it. At least it meant you were worth silencing. The hall clock ticked. 2 young women who had shared a table for 7 years looked at each other properly for the first time. "Where will you go?" Clara asked at last. "An aunt near Harrogate, my father's sister. She is poor and cheerful, and I shall hate it." A ghost of the old Vivian flickered, then went out honestly. "No, I don't know what I shall be away from her. I have never once been allowed to find out." Clara took the case. Then she reached into it, lifted the necklace her mother had promised her across 20 years and 2 lifetimes, and looked at it in the light, and then at the girl who had brought it back. "Write to me from Harrogate," Clara said. "I warn you, I will answer. I have 7 years of letters in me, and nobody has ever let me send them." It was not forgiveness quite. It was a door left unlatched, which is what forgiveness looks like before it is grown. Vivian understood. She nodded once and walked out of Whitfield Hall lighter than she had walked in, and though neither knew it yet, toward a Harrogate curate, a crowded happy parsonage, and a life so ordinary and so loud with children that she would one day write to Clara, "Nobody here has ever once told me to hush, and I find I have surprisingly little to say. It is a great mystery." Whitfield Hall came back to life, the way a garden does, not all at once, but bed by bed. Mrs. Hobbs returned within the week, fetched from Ashworth Park in the Duke's own carriage, which mortified her into 3 days of magnificent temper. Clara met her on the steps, and the old woman began, "Miss Clara, I'll want a full accounting of what state that kitchen," and got no further, because her girl had thrown both arms around her in front of the entire staff, which was not done, and was done anyway, and the little kitchen maid burst into tears by the green baize door, and nobody scolded her. Clara made Mrs. Hobbs housekeeper again, with doubled wages, rooms in the south corner where the sun came, and a girl to carry for her on the stairs. The rest of the household she rebuilt one considered kindness at a time. Colonel Harrow, her guardian now, came every Thursday to dine, to bellow cheerfully about the estate accounts she managed better than he could, and to fall asleep by the fire, exactly like the grandfather nature had failed to provide and Providence had finally supplied. And the Duke of Ashworth called. He called with a formality that made Mrs. Hobbs snort into her keys, flowers, correct half-hours, the colonel solemnly present as propriety required. But the correct half-hours had a way of becoming afternoons, and the afternoons walks, and the walks that particular lane by the mill stream, where a horse once trailed behind 2 people like a patient chaperone, and where sound, as everyone now knew, carries. Nobody in the county doubted how it would end. The county, for once, was right, but even the county could not have guessed the manner of it. Because when the question came, it did not come on a walk, or in a garden, or on one knee in any of the places questions are supposed to come. It came at a dinner. The first great dinner of Clara's own, giving Whitfield Hall glowing again, the long table laid, 40 candles lit, and the company gathered. Colonel Harrow at Clara's right, the vicar and his wife, neighbors who had once lowered their eyes at a ball and had been invited anyway because Clara chose largeness, and at the far end, in gray silk that was new and hers and chosen, Mrs. Martha Hobbs, dining at the family table over her own scandalized objections, by written invitation of the mistress of the house. Clara sat at the head of her father's table, her table, and talked. That was all, and it was everything. She asked the vicar's quiet wife what she thought of the new school and waited for the answer. She drew out the colonel. She caught the young footman's eye when he juggled the serving spoon and gave him the old small nod, no harm done. She laughed freely at something Mrs. Hobbs said. Nathaniel, seated at her left, spoke hardly at all. He was watching her the way a man watches the sun come up over land he has crossed in the dark. And between the last course and the sweets, in a lull of candlelight and contentment, the Duke of Ashworth rose from his chair. The table quieted. He looked down its length, the silver, the light, the faces, and then at the woman at its head, and anyone could see there was a speech prepared in him, and anyone could see him let it go, the way you let go of a beautiful speech when you have finally learned what beautiful speeches are worth. He came around to her chair and knelt in front of every soul at that table. Clara, his voice was not quite steady and he did not fight it. I once asked you a question at a dinner table. May I ask another? Clara Whitfield looked down at him, at this man kneeling on her floor at her table in her father's house, in the light of 40 candles, in front of the colonel and the vicar and the neighbors and Martha Hobbs, whose serviette was already at her eyes. And the woman who had once been unable to speak at dinner for 7 years answered him in a voice that rang the length of the table, past the candles, out into the hall, up the stairs of that old and finally happy house, the loudest word she had ever said in her life. Yes. 1 year later, Ashworth Park at night was something out of a dream, but it was a different dream now. Lights blazed in the 40 windows as they had on the night of a certain ball. Carriages rolled up the long drive. But if you had slipped inside on this particular October evening, past the stone lions and the great doors, you would have found no crowd of 100 strangers, no glittering crush, no whispering behind fans. You would have found a dinner. The long table in the great dining room was laid with the good silver, and every chair was full, and the company was the strangest fine company in England, which was exactly how the mistress of the house liked it. Colonel Harrow sat mid-table, disputing happily with the vicar about turnips. The vicar's quiet wife was not quiet at all anymore. A year of being asked what she thought had cured her completely, and she was at that moment holding forth on the new village school, her school now, funded from the Whitfield estate, where every child in the parish, boys and girls alike, was taught to read whether it gave them ideas above their station or not. It did. That was the point. Near the head of the table sat Mrs. Martha Hobbs, in wine-colored silk, wearing the expression of a woman who had objected to her seat in writing, been overruled in writing, and privately kept the letter of overruling in her Bible. She was 62 now, housekeeper of Ashworth Park, chief general of both great houses, if the truth were told, and beside her sat a young under-housekeeper, once a little kitchen maid who used to press her apron to her mouth by a green baize door, and who tonight had opinions on the household accounts and gave them. Because that was the custom of this house. It had no name and it needed none. The whole county knew it. At the Duchess of Ashworth's table everyone spoke. Once a week the upper servants dined with the family and were asked their views, and their views were heard. Guests learned the custom quickly or dined elsewhere. One baronet's wife, early in the year, had raised an eyebrow at a footman being asked his opinion of the harvest, and had murmured something about standards and manners. Manners, the Duchess had agreed pleasantly from the head of the table, are how we treat people. I was taught that by an expert. Do try the pheasant. The baronet's wife had not been invited again. Almost everyone else had. At the head of that table now sat Clara, Duchess of Ashworth, mistress of 2 houses, patroness of 1 school, answerer of a great many letters. Around her throat, catching the candlelight, lay a necklace of pearls and small sapphires. She wore it on the nights that mattered. One of the letters answered that very morning had come from a parsonage near Harrogate, crossed and recrossed in a hasty, happy scrawl, full of a curate husband and a christening and a postscript that had made Clara laugh out loud at the breakfast table. Nobody here has ever once told me to hush, and I find I have surprisingly little to say. It is a great mystery. Come and be godmother. Of Bath and a certain boarding house, the letters said nothing because there was nothing to say. A respectable widow resided there on a regular annuity, dined nightly among ladies who found her cold and was troubled by no one, and troubled no one, which was the whole of the arrangement and the whole of the sentence. The world had simply moved on from her. It was Mrs. Hobbs who had pronounced the final word on the subject, a year ago, and no one had ever needed to add to it. Providence has a tidy way with a table. And at Clara's right hand, where he had sat at every dinner for a year and intended to sit for all the rest of them, was her husband. Nathaniel had changed, the county said. The silent Duke was silent no longer, or rather, his silences had changed their nature. They were the comfortable kind now, the kind a man wears when he is exactly where he wishes to be. He still listened more than he spoke. But he laughed. The county had needed some months to adjust to the fact of it, and when he did speak at this table, it was often to do the small thing he did now, as the sweets came in and the candles burned low. He turned to the youngest person present. She was 11, the gardener's granddaughter, invited because she had that week won the school's first reading prize, and she had sat through dinner in her best dress, round-eyed and mute with awe, exactly as overwhelmed as a child at a duke's table ought to be. "And what do you think, Miss Tilly?" the Duke of Ashworth asked her gravely. "Of the school and the books, we are told your opinion is worth having." The whole table quieted and turned, not the freezing quiet of a certain dinner long ago, but a warm one, a making-room one. And the child looked down the candlelight at all those grand, kind faces waiting, actually waiting, and found, to her own astonishment, that she had a voice, and used it. And the table listened, and the vicar said, "Well said, by George," which he had borrowed from the colonel, who claimed he had invented it. Under the table, Clara's hand found her husband's and held it. "You do that at every dinner," she murmured. "I do," he said. "At this table no one is silenced. Manners, you see." He raised her hand and kissed it there in front of everyone, scandalously, gladly. Real ones. Later, much later, when the carriages had rolled away and the candles were being snuffed 100 by 100, and the great house was settling into its warm dark, Clara climbed the stairs to the nursery, as she did every night, no matter how late the company left. The fire was low and golden. The nurse rose, smiling, and slipped out, and Clara leaned over the cradle where her daughter lay sleeping, 3 months old, a scrap of a thing with her father's dark hair, and already, unmistakably, her grandmother's gray eyes. They had named her Margaret. Clara stood there a long while in the firelight, in the quiet, the good quiet, the chosen kind, the kind that is a room and not a cage. Somewhere below, a door closed softly, a floorboard settled, the old house breathed. She thought, as she often thought at this hour, of a girl of 13 at a long table, staring at her plate, swallowing her words. She could summon that girl still. She always would. But the girl no longer sat alone. A whole future had come to sit beside her, and the table had grown very long and very bright and very loud with voices. Margaret stirred in her sleep, one small fist opening like a leaf. And Clara, Duchess of Ashworth, who had learned everything there was to know about silence and chosen speech, and built a house where no one would ever have to make that choice again, bent down and pressed her lips to her daughter's forehead, and gave her the only inheritance that had ever really mattered, 4 words, whispered into the firelight like a vow. "You will always be heard." Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.